Hey guys, today we're going to do this chipped paint effect with Hairspray without having to spend out on one of these. Right, before we get rolling, this is the effect we're going for, this kind of scratched and chipped paint that you usually would have to use Hairspray and an airbrush for, but we're going to do it without the airbrush, so let's start. Right, back in the garage, nothing fancy. I've primed the piece that I'm going to be working on with a brown rattle can primer. I'd actually use graffiti paint here because it's a lot better. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to using the Hairspray. So I buy maximum hold or firm hold Hairspray. Yes, I know what Hairspray is. And I find that this one doesn't come off as easily as the other one, and therefore you get a bit better control over your weathering, especially if we're not using an airbrush. So we're just coming in and giving it a nice even coat like this. Hairspray comes out nice and slow, so it's not too difficult to do. You can handle it with your fingers, it's not the end of the world. I'll give it a nice coat like this on the other side, and then leave it to dry for about an hour. And this is the chipped Hairspray-like technique that we're going for, that you normally would use an airbrush for. Very quick and easy, as you'll see here. I've done some testing on this piece to make sure it worked, and I'm going to show you how to do it now. So you do need to use a paint that has good coverage here because it needs to be very dry. So I do tend to use miniature paints for this, but they go a very, very long way, and you wouldn't do this across an enormous piece of terrain that was textured, for example. You'd do it on these flat things like tanks and things. Using a makeup brush, these are designed for putting on foundation and things, so they give a nice matte, a smooth matte finish, which is what people want when they're using them for makeup. And you're just going to dab it in and sponge it a bit like this, and we are just going to pat it on. Now you don't want to go over an area once you've been over it once. If you find that it needs more coverage, just leave it to dry and come back again. I think I did like 2 to 3 coats on these other pieces, and you're just tapping it on like this, and it's leaving a nice matte smooth texture behind. And if you're getting to awkward places like this corner in here, use the square edge of the brush, makeup sponge, or cut it so that you can press it into where you need to get to, like that. So I'll give this a quick coat. And much like paint with an airbrush, I've gone round once, and by the time I've gone round to one side, you see it's a little patchy in places. This tide I started is already dried, so then I can just get some more paint. You don't need a lot when you're doing the second coat, so that goes a very long way. And we're just going to block it in to make sure we've got a nice solid red coat here. And there we go, got a nice good coverage. It's only taken me a couple of minutes to do this, not even that really. Certainly much faster than setting up and spraying with an airbrush, especially if you're rubbish with an airbrush like I am. So it's got good coverage, so what we're going to do now is we're going to get ourselves some water. Warm water will work faster, and we're going to use the Hairspray that's underneath the paint in order to break it away and give us this lovely broken colour texture here where it looks like it's got nice scratch marks and everything. Okay, so things we're going to need here are a soft brush for applying the water, a stiff bristled brush. This is for stippling, but it's got good bristles for scraping and scratching, or a toothbrush will work, but it's just a little bigger. You can always trim the toothbrush to fit. You can see this one's got quite a lot of wear, and just a pot full of water here, and all you're going to do is re-wet the paint. So this doesn't actually re-wet the paint because the paint acrylic is now dried. What it does is it's going to soak into the paint, rehydrate the Hairspray that's underneath, and loosen it all up. So I'm just going to put a nice coat on like this, and give it a minute just to soak into the paint, cover a large area like this. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your bristly brush and you're going to start removing the paint. So here's a good way to test how easy is it coming off, and you can see here already it's coming off quite easy. Unfortunately the glossy water makes that difficult to see, but if I do it on a downward facing bit, you can see it's starting to scrape away the paint there. So if you do strokes, obviously it's going to look like scratched paint. Do little circular buffing motions to make like larger areas of peeled paint like that, or you can do tapping. By doing it with a tap, you create little micro marks, and it's a lot more varied. It doesn't have to even be that obvious. Just tapping it on like that. If I bring that up, you can see little bits of brown are showing there, which is why it's good to use a contrasting colour underneath. On hard edges like this, again, we just wet it and let it soak, and then just by brushing the brush over, you're going to simulate that wear and tear on a sharp edge like that, and you can see it's just taking the paint off on the edges here. And I will dry this and come back. If you get some red colour transfer to the paint where there's particles and things, you can just give it a wipe with a bit of tissue paper and you're good to go. And there you have it. Without the cost and complexity of using an airbrush, we've got that same hairspray weathering effect. Nicely chipped around here. We've got the little micro chips here where we stabbed at it, scratches where we've scratched at it, and then on this face where we've worn it with the brush on the high wear areas at the corners, you've got a nice bit of paint chipping going on here. And you can stop and start as you need to do a little bit, dry it, let it see how it looks, and you can keep rehydrating it. And then what I'll do now is I'll take this away and give this a coat of varnish, and that will lock everything in and make sure that the hairspray can't be rehydrated and everything's fixed in place. After a couple of simple additions, some transfers and a little bit of acrylic paint streaking, you can see that what was a boring large flat area is now much more interesting without the need to glue on loads of little details and things. So it doesn't really take much to jazz it up, and this hairspray technique on something like a pipe, a tank or any kind of flat area is an absolute winner, and you do not need an airbrush. And here's a close-up of the finished look after it's had its matte varnish. It has had a matte despite my reflective lights in the garage, and overall it really adds the effect, that extra bit of chipping from just a little sponge work on it, but you can see how small some of those micro scratches are from the toothbrush, and where you've got the spotting effect and these scratches here. Really worth doing, low effort, and you don't need to spend out on an expensive airbrush. So stick around guys, next week I'm planning to do a video on painting my 3D prints to kind of help out with dealing with the layer lines, so maybe we can do a little bit of this on the flat areas and see.